change the sheets after Henry had been on them. It was impossible to breathe and sleep, demanded Queen Margaret of Valois. Married life was not going well. She didn't like her husband, and besides, he smelled bad. The last of the Valois. According to the prediction of Nostradamus, the Valois dynasty was to fade away, and its last representative will be the sixth child of Catherine de' Medici, daughter Margaret, who later became the famous Queen Margot, whose story struck Alexander Dumas himself. The life of this woman was subordinated to love, for the sake of which Margot could sacrifice everything. Margaret Valois was born May 14, 1553, in the castle of Saint-Germain-en-Laye, in the 20th year of marriage of her parents. Margaret already as a child had the makings of a real beauty. However, she was no prettier than her sister Elizabeth, and even less beautiful than the little Scottish Queen Mary Stuart. Margaret grew up under the watchful supervision of her mother and received a very thorough education, befitting not only her position, but also her intelligence and ability. The little princess turned out to be a very intelligent student and learned several languages, which she spoke as well as her native tongue. Margaret grew up a real beauty. She had lush brown hair, expressive brown eyes, and beautifully curved forehead, shaped nose, and well-defined chin. The opinion of Margaret's beauty may seem, to put it mildly, greatly exaggerated. However, in those days there were quite different standards of beauty. From an early age, Margaret had very good taste in choosing her closet. Her mother used to say that it was not for her to imitate others, but for others to imitate her style of dress. However, Margot gave Catherine a lot of trouble, and the reason for this was her cool temper. According to gossip, the future Queen of Navarre had an affair with her older brothers, or at least with one of them, Henry. She herself admitted in her memoirs that it was Henry who introduced her to the art of love. But was this really the case? The relationship between Margaret and her middle brother was bad, and Henry repeatedly made it clear that he felt antipathy towards his sister. In revenge, Margot may have slandered her brother in her memoirs, making herself look like an innocent victim. When Margaret was 17 years old, there was a huge scandal, as the princess fell in love with a completely unsuitable man. The chosen one was the Catherine de' Medici sworn enemy Henry de Guise, or rather his family. This union did not meet with the approval of either the Medici, the Valois, or the Guises. When this was reported to Catherine, she decided to immediately put an end to the disgraceful connection of her daughter. On June 25, 1570, she and her sons Charles and Henry burst into Margaret's bedroom and caught her with Henry de Guise. Catherine, in a fit of rage, began pulling Guise away from her daughter. Margaret covered her lover with herself, and the brothers mindlessly clubbed both of them. As a result, Henry managed to jump out of the window, and all the anger of the French royal family fell on Margaret. So ended their relationship. Neither the princess nor her lover did not dare to continue the affair. Catherine de' Medici decided to tame the stroppy temper of her daughter with the help of a decoction of sorrel, which should have cooled the ardor of the princess. But the sorrel did not help the feisty and amorous Margaret. Catherine decided that it was time to marry off her temperamental daughter. Since her older sister had died 2 years earlier, the queen decided to marry Margaret to the widowed Philip. Unfortunately, the plan failed, as the King of Spain politely replied that the church considered it incestuous to marry the sister of a deceased wife. This was a clear evasion of marriage, as such a marriage could take place with the permission of the Pope, but the king probably did not want to become a cuckold, as rumors of Margaret Valois's behavior reached the Spanish court as well. Her scandalous reputation probably also prevented her marriage to the king's son from his first marriage, Don Carlos. Another candidate for the princess's husband was the heir to the Portuguese throne, but these plans also failed. In the end, it was decided to marry Margaret to Henry of Bourbon, son of Jeanne d'Albret, the Protestant Queen of Navarre, and Antoine de Bourbon, a member of the younger branch of the Capetines. The wedding was to end conflicts between Huguenots and Catholics, so this union was in the interests of both France and Protestant Navarre. It seemed that the couple would be successful because they were the same age, both young, healthy, and attractive, and also had another common feature, a love and exuberant character. However, the future bride was not satisfied with the candidate. Despite her promiscuity, Margaret was a Catholic, and the thought of marrying an infidel disgusted her. The marriage was discussed as early as 1561, when Margaret's father, King Henry II, said he saw little Henry as his future son-in-law. The whole year 1571 passed in negotiations on the marriage of Henry with Margaret, which were led by his mother, Jeanne d'Albret, and Catherine de' Medici. In 1572, the marriage contract was finally signed. Henry was able to marry the beautiful Margaret, but to tell the truth, he was in no great hurry. He stayed at Newark Castle for a month, where he was having an affair with the daughter of the local gardener, and his bride was not too discouraged about it. In the meantime, Jeanne d'Albret had had a chance to get a glimpse of her future daughter-in-law. Surprisingly, although she was aware of her scandalous lifestyle, she did not resent it. On the contrary, she blamed the state of affairs on the environment in which the girl had grown up. In Margaret herself, she saw only merits and considered reprehensible only excessive tendency of the bride of her son to white powder. She also thought that the latter flaunted her charms too much. "I wish you would get married as soon as possible and take your wife away from this rotten environment." I knew it was a rotten court, but I didn't realize it was to this extent. Unfortunately, Jeanne d'Albret did not live to see Henry's wedding. She died suddenly on June 9, 1572. Although the official announcement stated that she died of natural causes, all of Paris was shaken by rumors that behind Jeanne's death was a man of Catherine who more than once helped his mistress to get rid of political opponents. Henry learned of his mother's death, and that he had inherited power in Navarre on the way to the wedding, when he was bored by the charms of the beautiful daughter of the gardener. He entered Paris on July 8 at the head of 800 knights, dressed like himself, in mourning clothes. From all over the country and the capital came in noble Huguenots, for whom the marriage of the sister of the Catholic king with a Protestant meant the hope of ending religious wars. Charles IX knew Henry from childhood and received him with due honor. Meanwhile, his bride made it clear to him at every turn that she was marrying Henry against her will. Henry did not care too much about the moods of his future wife. After all, the wedding was predetermined, and he found comfort in the arms of beautiful court ladies and Parisians. It is said that Margot would have done anything to prevent the wedding, but she feared that if she defied her all-powerful mother and brothers, she would be poisoned by them. Oh, manners! Besides disliking the King of Navarre, Margaret had another reason not to marry. She was in love with someone else. She fell in love with the handsome and gallant Joseph Boniface de la Mole, a friend of the youngest of the Valois Hercule Francis. Margaret was careful to keep her affair a secret. On the occasion of the wedding, Henry and his courtiers abandoned their mourning robes and dressed in festive, rich, and colorful attire. Margot, as befitted a bride, looked extremely beautiful. A crown shone on her head, her dress sparkled with precious stones sewn on it, and everything was completed by a blue cloak, the plume of which was carried by 3 princesses. Unfortunately, her behavior left much to be desired. Not only did she not deign to say a word to her husband, but she laughed and joked with the young men, and now and then cast meaningful glances at Joseph de la Mole. Not without scandal, the groom, being a Protestant, the whole ceremony stood with his head covered, and Margaret herself did not even answer the priest when asked if she agreed to marry Henry. In response to her silence, her brother, King Charles IX, placed his hand on her head, causing her sister to nod yes, which was taken as consent. Because of the religion of the newlyweds, the ceremony was divided into 2 stages by 2 rites. The Huguenots must have felt uncomfortable and suspected that something bad was about to happen. Among Henry's companions was Admiral de Coligny, who was urged to leave Paris without delay. He was also urged to leave the capital by Charles IX himself. But the admiral politely declined, explaining that the Protestant churches had asked him to remain in case of possible disturbances expected by the Huguenots. Marriage night. Things were much worse for the newlyweds. The wedding night was not a pleasure for either Margaret or Henry, although the marriage was consummated. All because the newlyweds disliked each other. The reason for this was allegedly the stench emanating from Henry. By the way, this problem was also pointed out by his subsequent minions, so it was not an invention of spoiled Margot. Perhaps it was due to some illness or diet, but the fact is that Henry himself admitted that he was not a stickler for hygiene. It is said that he often returned from the battlefield or from hunting after a day in the saddle and did not take a bath before going to bed. The reason for this could have been health concerns, because the medics of the time argued that bathing expands the pores, through which germs more easily penetrate the human body and infectious diseases carry a deadly danger. Whatever the reasons for Henry's behavior, Margaret changed the bedclothes after each night spent with her husband. Bartholomew's night. It soon became clear that the Protestants had expected a trick from this wedding for a reason. Catherine de' Medici decided to get rid of the problem with the infidels once and for all, and persuaded Charles IX to start a bloody massacre with the Huguenots. Knowing the negative attitude of the inhabitants of Paris, they were secretly distributed weapons, hoping for the support of the people in the fight against the Protestants. It all began with an assassination attempt on Admiral Coligny, who escaped death with only a bullet. It was eventually determined that Henry de Guise, who was rumored to suspect the admiral of ordering the assassination of his father, was behind the attack. However, a more detailed investigation turned up Queen Catherine de' Medici herself, although Margaret claims in her memoirs that her brother Henry was the direct organizer. Unrest began among the Huguenots present in Paris. The unhappy King of France, prone to depression since childhood, turned to his mother for advice. Catherine was just waiting for this. She easily convinced her son that his country was once again on the brink of civil war, and the cause was the Protestants, as usual, planning an uprising. At an evening meeting held at the Louvre on August 23, 1572, Catherine convinced the king to take drastic measures. Charles ordered the massacre of all the Huguenots then in Paris. The streets of Paris were stained with Protestant blood. During the riots on the night of St. Bartholomew, more than 3,000 Huguenots were killed. One of the Protestants was saved by Margot herself, embracing him and protecting him from her brother's murderers when he panicked and fled from them, and piled into her bedroom. Although Margaret disliked her husband and avoided his company, she did not wish him harm, and certainly did not want him dead. Henry converted to Catholicism to save his life. Henry eventually fled to Navarre in 1576, seizing an opportunity during a hunting trip. Meanwhile, the unfortunate Margaret was going through a terrible time. Although she was formally bound in marriage to Henry of Navarre, she found happiness in the arms of the Comte de la Mole. Unfortunately, in 1574, her lover was unjustly accused of plotting against the life of her brother King Charles. And all because of a wax doll found in his house and pinned with pins, which also had to be hair and nails of the monarch and made it astrologer, master of secret knowledge Cosimo Ruggeri. The unfortunate count was imprisoned, tortured, and, although he never confessed to plotting against the king, sentenced to death. When Margaret heard this, she despaired. Since Charles was known for his fondness for white clothes, Margot put on the most beautiful white dress and went to the king's chambers to beg on her knees for the life of her lover. However, on April 30, 1574, La Mole was executed. Rumor has it that Margot ordered de la Mole's head embalmed and then placed it in a jeweled casket, which she subsequently carried with her everywhere. Meanwhile, the condition of the King of France was deteriorating day by day, to the mental problems added to the aggravated tuberculosis. The monarch was thinning, weakening, and increasingly often expectorated blood. Before his death, he managed to call his brother-in-law, Henry Bourbon, who was at court at the time, and asked him to look after his favorite Maria Touchet and their illegitimate child. On May 30, 1574, Charles died. True, after the death of the monarch, Paris was plagued by rumors that the king was poisoned at the instigation of Catherine de' Medici, who dreamed of putting on the throne her favorite Henry III, but modern historians believe that the cause of death of the monarch was tuberculosis. The king became her son Henry III, who had already taken over the Polish throne, having won the election. After the return of her brother, Margaret had a hard time. She and Henry did not like each other very much. Margot, resigned to the loss of her beloved de la Mole, indulged in more and more novels. Of course, all her affairs were immediately reported to the king, who was furious at her sister's behavior. Margot had no desire to ask her brother's opinion or permission when she invited another man into her chambers. In spite of everything, Margaret tried to mediate between her brother and her husband, showing remarkable devotion to her husband. She always said that just because she did not love her husband did not mean she had to be his enemy. It soon became known that Margaret was entirely on the Catholic side, with Catholic preachers publicly calling her a saint despite her adultery with her husband. Moreover, the opposition wanted to overthrow her brother in order to put her on the French throne. The Salic law, which they even wanted to tweak for Margot's sake, was in the way. News of her sister's love affairs reached the king's ears, and the unfortunate Margot soon became a prisoner in her own home. Eventually, her royal brother agreed to let Margaret go to her unloved husband in Navarre. There she spent the next 3 years leading a scandalous lifestyle, once again changing favorites like gloves. Because Margot refused to imitate the wives of other monarchs and to tolerate other women around her husband, nor did she intend to remain faithful to him, the entire court was a spectator of the couple's incessant quarrels. Finally, in 1582, she felt tired of the endless bickering and decided to return to her family in Paris. While attending a grand ball at the Louvre, organized by her brother in early August, the Queen of Navarre was to represent the First Lady of France. The celebration, which should have been a moment of triumph for the beautiful Margot and a great opportunity to show off her new dress and jewelry, turned out to be a humiliation. The monarch did not hesitate to make a scandal and publicly reproach his sister not only in the affair with the rider, but also to name all the men who had been in her bed. Moreover, he accused her of having a child with Chambellan, whom she was carrying in secret. Humiliated Queen Margot, silently swallowing her tears, left the Louvre. That night, the king's men stormed the house of Chambellan, turning it upside down, and Margot seriously feared for her safety. Her former favorite had left Paris in time. Fearing her brother's wrath, Margaret packed her bags and traveled to Navarre. It later transpired that her brother suspected Margot of terminating her pregnancy and ordered her servants and doctor to be tortured. Henry III sent a letter to the King of Navarre hinting at his suspicions. Margaret, fearing that this might be grounds for divorce, immediately wrote to her mother, Catherine de' Medici, assuring her of her innocence. Catherine de' Medici helped her daughter with money, and Henry III, at her mother's insistence, tried to reconcile Margot with her husband after a scandal he himself had caused. When Margaret arrived in Navarre, her arrival did not arouse any warm feelings in her husband, and he continued to dislike her. In the meantime, Margaret had come to her senses and decided that her position would be greatly improved if she bore her husband a son. So she began to charm her husband. She even managed to get him into her alcove for one night, but it was not enough. In addition, Henry had an unfounded suspicion that Margot wanted to poison him. In 1584, on June 19, Francis, Catherine de' Medici's youngest son, died. Henry of Navarre automatically became heir to the throne. Since Henry had become a Protestant again soon after fleeing France, his candidacy was unacceptable to Catholics. At that time, Henry of Bourbon became involved with the ambitious and extremely intelligent Countess de Guiche, in addition to promising her marriage. Margot was terrified. She could easily have been disposed of. Fearing for her safety, Margot moved to Agen, a predominantly Catholic town. She soon surrendered the town to the supporters of the Catholic League and had a falling out with the locals. She stayed in her castle Carlet, which looked more like a bandit's nest than a royal residence. In addition, all her furniture and personal belongings were still in Agen. Linarac kept her company, organizing his lover's time as best he could, giving her balls, feasts, and other entertainments. Unfortunately, he soon bored Margot. One evening, Linarac entered her bedroom and found in his beloved's bed the young son of the local apothecary. The jealous man grabbed his sword and killed the unfortunate rival. Margot decided that the best solution was to leave Carlet. In October 1586, the King of France ordered her sister imprisoned in Ussen. Margot was arrested and taken to the castle. There, on the king's orders, her jewelry was taken from her, her trusted people were dismissed, and several local maidens were hired to serve her. All this Margot accepted calmly, but her brother didn't stop there. To further hurt his sister, he ordered the hanging of her next favorite, Gabriel d'Aubriac. Henry of Navarre, with the prospect of a French crown, allied himself with the Duc de Guise. It became clear to Henry III and his mother that in the event of his death, rule would pass to the Bourbons. To induce him to take his side, The monarch contrived to marry him to the daughter of the Duke of Lorraine, and as the chief obstacle to this plan was Margaret, the French king decided to eliminate his sister by poisoning her. Meanwhile, Margot, who possessed neither cunning nor intelligence, guessed that her life was in danger and reported all to the Duc de Guise, who was able to save her. The Queen of Navarre, with her head miraculously preserved, could indulge in the pleasures of life. Margot was not choosy about men at that time. She found joy in the arms of the son of the local coal miner. In 1589, Catherine de' Medici died, leaving a substantial inheritance that Margot did not receive because of her brother. The unfortunate Margaret tried to save her finances by selling off her jewelry and melting down silverware. Her hated brother Henry III, meanwhile, was facing serious problems in his state, in which he was making more and more enemies. In May 1588, Paris rebelled against him, forcing the king to flee and meet the Duc de Guise, who entered the city in triumph. The monarch retired to Blois. His opponent, the Duc de Guise, soon also arrived in Blois to enter into negotiations with the monarch. However, the negotiations did not take place, for on December 23 of that year, Guise was assassinated on Henry's orders. The Catholics were furious. On August 1, 1589, there was a perfectly successful assassination attempt on Henry III. Still conscious, the monarch, in the presence of witnesses, appointed Henry of Navarre as his successor. Margaret could breathe a sigh of relief. Her life was no longer in danger. Henry of Bourbon, having decided that Paris was worthy of Mass, changed his religion back to Catholic and was crowned King of France on February 27, 1594. He was still married to Margot, although they were married only on paper, as they had not seen each other for years. Meanwhile, Margaret had already reached the age when she had to say goodbye to the hope of motherhood, and the monarch needed an heir to the throne. In view of this state of affairs, the couple had to divorce, and the monarch had to find a new wife who would give him the desired heir. Margot agreed to the divorce. She demanded payment of debts and a salary of $14,000 a year for herself. The divorce was finalized in 1599, the reason being that the couple were too closely related. Margot was entitled to bear the title of queen. Margaret spent 18 years in gloomy Usan. In 1605, she returned to Paris in triumph. She was already over 50 years old, but she not only did not give up court life, but did not want to stop her amorous adventures. Unfortunately, Margot with age not only became fat, but also bald. It is not known what caused the loss of hair, perhaps liver or thyroid disease. She dealt with this problem by wearing wigs made from the hair of her butlers. Her former husband, who reigned in France as Henry, married Mary de' Medici in 16. His new wife lived up to his expectations as she gave birth to his desired son Louis a year after their marriage. Henry also cared for his former wife. He was very concerned about Margot's wastefulness and almost constantly advised her not to spend too much money on outfits. Along with her in Paris arrived her favorite 20-year-old date de Saint-Julien, the son of a simple carpenter whom she appointed her page and showered with gifts. Unfortunately, in a fit of jealousy, another of Margot's favorites shot date and paid for the crime with his life. After the death of the favorite, Margot dressed in black. This whole situation amused her ex-husband, who saw no reason for sadness and explained to Margaret that she would soon be able to replace the dead page boy with a dozen other, even more handsome boys. However, Margot decided to leave her former home, where every corner reminded her of her dead lover. Then she bought a plot of land for the construction of a palace opposite the Louvre, where she moved 2 years later. She continued to change favorites like gloves. In Paris, there were rumors that Margaret wore a special pouch under her dress, in which she kept boxes with the hearts of dead fans. King Henry died in Paris on May 14, 1610. He was assassinated by François Ravaillac, who attacked the monarch as he rode to meet the Duc de Sully. Margot attended the coronation of her former husband's son, and her presence, as the last representative of the House of Valois, symbolized the continuity of the dynasty. 4 years later, Margaret's health deteriorated to such an extent that she was forced to retire from court life and to end all love affairs. She died on March 27, 1615. The last representative of the Valois dynasty was buried in Saint Denis. Margot was famous not only for her beauty, outfits, or numerous novels, but also for her very bold views. She believed that women had the same rights as men. In her memoirs, she rhetorically asked if God, in creating the world and life, first created the simplest forms of life to finally create the most perfect, and the last of his creations was a woman who is really the crown of creation.